Texas, 1945. The mess hall at Camp Bowie smelled like sugar and hot oil, a scent so sweet it felt criminal. Corporal Klaus Miller stood frozen in the doorway, staring at trays piled high with golden rings that glistened under fluorescent lights. He had survived Stalingrad on frozen potatoes and sawdust bread. His sister's last letter mentioned tulip bulbs boiled into soup. Yet here, in the land of his enemies, American soldiers laughed while eating dessert for breakfast. The cognitive dissonance was so complete, so absolute, that Klaus felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The train had arrived 3 days earlier. 47 German prisoners stepped onto Texas soil in the dead of winter, though winter here meant something different than it did in Bavaria. The air was cool but not cold, dry instead of damp, and the sky stretched so impossibly wide that several men actually stumbled, disoriented by the absence of mountains on the horizon. They had been told many things about America, that its cities were made of steel and greed, that its people were soft, decadent, ruled by Jews and gangsters, that the land itself was hostile, filled with savages and wilderness. None of them had been told about donuts. The camp sprawled across flat grassland dotted with mesquite and scrub oak. Guard towers rose at each corner, wooden structures that looked almost temporary, as if the Americans hadn't expected to need them long. Inside the wire, rows of barracks stood in neat formation, their walls still smelling of fresh pine. The prisoners were processed efficiently, without cruelty. Names recorded, uniforms exchanged, Geneva Convention rights explained through interpreters who spoke German with strange American accents that made certain words sound almost comical. Franz Weber, a former schoolteacher from Munich, noticed everything. The way guards carried weapons casually, slung over shoulders like farming tools. How the camp commander, Colonel Davies, looked directly at them when he spoke, not through them. The absence of dogs. In the camps he'd heard about, the Russian ones, German prisoners were starved and worked until they collapsed. Here, someone had planted flowers near the administration building. That first night they were fed. Not scraps, not punishment rations. Actual food. Beef stew with vegetables, bread that was soft instead of hard, and coffee that came in metal cups instead of rusty tins. The portions were generous, almost obscene. Several men wept while eating, unable to reconcile the taste of real meat with the propaganda they'd absorbed for years. Wolfgang Schneider, who had been captured outside Aachen with his entire platoon, ate so quickly he vomited afterward, his stomach unable to process richness after months of deprivation. But it was breakfast the next morning that shattered their understanding of war. The mess hall was a long wooden structure with windows running its length, letting in morning light that fell across rows of tables and benches. The prisoners filed in at dawn, still cautious, still uncertain about what came next. They expected porridge, perhaps, hard bread, watered-down coffee. Instead, they found eggs, bacon, sausages that actually contained meat. And then, carried out on metal trays by American cooks who wore white aprons and whistled while they worked, came the donuts. Perfect golden circles, still warm from the fryer, dusted with sugar that caught the light like snow. Some had holes in the center. Others were filled with jam that leaked red at the edges. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of sweetness and fat that made Klaus's mouth water involuntarily. He watched an American sergeant grab 3 without hesitation, stack them on his tray, and douse them in more sugar from a shaker that seemed to exist solely for that purpose. "What is that?" Hans Richter whispered in German, staring at the display. "I don't know," Klaus admitted. "Pastry of some kind." Franz, who had taught English before the war, recognized the word printed on a small card near the tray. Donuts. He tried to pronounce it correctly, but the American O sound was different from German, shorter, almost dismissive. A young private heard him attempt the word and grinned. "Go on, Fritzy. They ain't gonna bite you." Klaus was the first to take one. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the pastry, surprised by its weight, its warmth, the way sugar crystals fell from its surface like tiny stars. He carried it back to his table where 6 other Germans sat in silence, all staring at the strange circular food as if it might be poisoned or contaminated, or some kind of elaborate American joke. He took a bite. The texture hit him first. Crisp exterior giving way to soft, almost fluffy interior that dissolved on his tongue. Then came the sweetness, so pure and unapologetic it felt like a childhood memory. His mother had made krapfen during fashing, fried dough filled with jam, but they had been dense, heavy, something you earned after fasting. This was different. This was light, airy, designed purely for pleasure. No suffering required, no penance demanded. Just sweetness for sweetness's sake. The mess hall stopped breathing. Every German prisoner watched Klaus's face, waiting for his reaction, needing to know if this was real or another wartime illusion. His eyes were closed. A single tear ran down his cheek, carving a line through dust and exhaustion and despair. When he opened his mouth to speak, no words came. Instead, he took another bite, larger this time, and made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. The dam broke. 47 men reached for donuts. Some took one, others took 3, cramming them into mouths that had forgotten what abundance tasted like. Werner Kessler, who hadn't smiled since his capture, bit into a jelly-filled donut and watched red jam spill onto his fingers with an expression of pure wonder. Otto Braun, a farmer's son from Prussia, held his donut up to the light as if studying a religious artifact, trying to understand how something so simple could contain so much joy. The American soldiers watched with expressions ranging from amusement to confusion. They couldn't comprehend what they were witnessing, because they couldn't comprehend the deprivation that made this moment sacred. To them, donuts were casual food, gas station purchases, something you grabbed without thinking. To the Germans, these golden rings represented everything the propaganda had said was impossible. American abundance, American generosity, American disregard for the cruel mathematics of war that said enemies must suffer. Sergeant Bill Morrison, who had served in North Africa before being reassigned to guard duty, stood near the kitchen door watching the prisoners eat. He'd seen men cry before. He'd seen them scream, beg, rage against death. But this was different. This was grief processed through sweetness, ideology dissolving in sugar and oil. He made a mental note to request more donuts for tomorrow's breakfast. By the end of that first week, donuts had become sacred. The prisoners talked about them constantly. They debated the proper way to eat them, whether to savor small bites or devour them quickly before the sugar melted. They compared the glazed ones to the powdered ones, the plain ones to the filled ones, developing preferences and hierarchies that gave structure to their captivity. Franz started keeping notes in a small journal he'd been allowed to keep, describing each variety with the precision of a wine critic documenting vintages. The glazed variety, he wrote in careful German script, possesses a coating that hardens slightly when cool, creating textural contrast with the soft interior. The sweetness is less aggressive than the powdered sugar version, more subtle, almost elegant. Americans consume these with coffee, black and strong, which cuts the sweetness and creates balance. I believe this represents something fundamental about American culture. They do not deny themselves pleasure, but they also understand moderation within excess. The camp commander noticed the effect. Colonel Davies had run 3 different POW camps during the war, and he prided himself on understanding his prisoners. He'd seen men broken by capture, men who refused to work, men who clung to Nazi ideology even after Germany's obvious defeat. But he'd also seen men change, watched propaganda crack under the weight of contradictory evidence. The donut phenomenon intrigued him enough to mention it in his weekly report to headquarters. Morale among German prisoners remains high, he wrote. Integration into work programs proceeding smoothly. Notable observation: breakfast pastries have created unexpected diplomatic bridge. Recommend continuing current food protocols. What he didn't write, because it seemed too absurd for an official report, was that donuts were defeating fascism more effectively than any propaganda film ever could. The work assignments began in the second week. German prisoners were sent out in groups under minimal guard to work on local farms, repair roads, harvest crops. Texas was desperate for labor with so many men overseas fighting, and the POWs represented a solution to an economic crisis. They were paid in camp scrip, small amounts that could be spent at the camp canteen on cigarettes, chocolate, and other small luxuries. Klaus found himself assigned to a ranch 40 miles from camp, driven out each morning in the back of a truck with 8 other prisoners. The rancher, a man named Tom Fletcher who looked older than Texas itself, regarded them with neither hostility nor warmth, just the pragmatic assessment of someone evaluating livestock. "You boys know anything about cattle?" he asked through an interpreter. Several men nodded. Most were lying. German farm boys knew pigs and chickens, maybe some dairy cows. Texas longhorns were different animals entirely, half-wild things with horns like spears and temperaments that could shift from docile to dangerous without warning. Fletcher seemed to know they were lying, but didn't care. "You'll learn," he said simply. "Work starts at 6, lunch at noon. We finish when we finish." The work was hard but not cruel. They mended fences, moved cattle, cleared brush from grazing land. The sun burned differently here than in Europe, more direct, relentless. But Fletcher provided water, shade during the hottest hours, and at noon his wife brought lunch that included, without fail, donuts from the batch she made every Sunday. These were different from the camp donuts. Homemade, slightly irregular in shape. Some were twisted instead of round, some had cinnamon mixed into the sugar coating, and all of them carried the warmth of being made by hand rather than mass-produced in a military kitchen. Mrs. Fletcher was a small woman, with sun-weathered skin and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She never spoke to the prisoners directly, but she watched them eat her donuts with an expression that might have been satisfaction. "She's judging us," Klaus whispered to Werner one afternoon as they sat in the shade of a water tank eating lunch. "What?" "Mrs. Fletcher. She's watching to see if we appreciate her cooking." Werner considered this while biting into a cinnamon sugar donut that left powder on his upper lip. "Do you think she knows what this means to us?" "I think she knows we were hungry. Maybe that's enough." By midsummer, the camp had settled into routine. Prisoners worked, ate, slept, and tried not to think too hard about what was happening back home. Mail from Germany came sporadically, letters that took months to arrive and had been opened and read by censors who crossed out anything sensitive. Klaus received a letter from his mother in July that had been written in February. She mentioned rationing, air raids, and the fact that his youngest sister now worked in a munitions factory. The tone was carefully neutral, designed to pass through censors without triggering attention, but Klaus could read the desperation between the lines. "We are managing," she wrote. "Do not worry about us. I think of you always." That night, Klaus lay in his bunk and thought about donuts. Not the taste, though that remained burned into his memory like a brand, but the existence, the casual abundance, the fact that in America, even prisoners of war ate dessert for breakfast, while his mother rationed potato peels. The cognitive dissonance was so profound it actually hurt, a physical ache in his chest that made breathing difficult. Franz noticed. He climbed into the bunk above Klaus and spoke quietly in the darkness. "You received a letter?" "Yes." "From home?" "Yes." "Was it bad?" Klaus didn't answer immediately. Bad was relative. His mother was alive, his sisters were working, their house still stood. Compared to Stalingrad, compared to Dresden, compared to the rumors they heard about what was happening in the East, it wasn't bad, but it also wasn't good. "They're hungry," he finally said. "My mother, my sisters. They're hungry, and I'm eating donuts." Franz was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I've been thinking about that." "About what?" "About why this feels so wrong. We were taught that suffering builds character, that deprivation creates strength, that the German people were great because they could endure hardship. And then we come here, to the land of our enemies, and find that they're strong precisely because they've never had to endure that kind of suffering. They're strong because they have enough, because their children don't go hungry, because they waste sugar on frivolous pastries." Klaus stared at the bunk above him, barely visible in the darkness. "You're saying we were wrong." "I'm saying the propaganda was wrong. There's a difference." Is there? Franz didn't answer, but Klaus heard him shift in his bunk, restless with thoughts too large for the confined space of their barracks. The summer heat intensified. Work on the Fletcher ranch became almost unbearable during midday hours, even with shade breaks. The prisoners adapted, learning to work in the early morning and late evening, resting during the peak heat when even the cattle sought shelter. Tom Fletcher proved to be a fair boss, neither cruel nor particularly friendly, just consistent. He expected work done properly, and when it was, he showed approval through action rather than words. Better food, occasional rides into town for supplies where prisoners could see American normalcy up close. It was during one of these town trips that Klaus saw his first American donut shop. They had stopped in a small Texas town whose name he never learned, just a main street with a few stores and a general sense of sleepy permanence. Fletcher needed to pick up parts for a broken tractor, and while he conducted business, the prisoners sat in the truck bed under guard supervision. The guard, a teenage private named Jimmy who seemed barely old enough to shave, was more interested in reading a Superman comic than watching his charges. Klaus watched the donut shop across the street. It was a small storefront with a red and white striped awning and a window display that showed fresh donuts arranged on paper doilies. A hand-painted sign read, "Hot and fresh daily." People entered and exited in steady stream, emerging with white paper bags and expressions of casual satisfaction. A woman with 2 children, an elderly man in overalls, a young couple holding hands. None of them treated it as special. It was just Tuesday morning, just donuts. The cognitive dissonance hit Klaus so hard he actually gasped. This casual abundance, this everyday luxury, existed while Europe burned, while his mother rationed bread, while cities crumbled under Allied bombs. The war that had consumed his entire adult life was, to these people, something happening elsewhere, something that didn't interrupt their morning pastries. "You okay?" Jimmy asked, glancing up from his comic book. Klaus realized he was crying, silent tears running down his face while he stared at a donut shop in a Texas town whose name he didn't know. He tried to answer, but couldn't form words in English, couldn't explain what he was feeling to this American teenager who had never known hunger, never watched friends die, never stood in his mother's kitchen and pretended that watery soup was sufficient. Jimmy seemed uncomfortable. "Hey, Fletcher said you guys could get something if you wanted. From the donut place. I got money for it." Klaus stared at him. "What?" "Fletcher gave me money. Said if you guys worked hard, which you did, you could get donuts. As like a treat or whatever." The other prisoners had heard. They turned, disbelieving, watching Jimmy fumble with dollar bills and then gesture toward the shop. "Go on. Get whatever you want. Just don't run off or I'll get in trouble." 8 German POWs crossed a Texas street and entered a donut shop. The bell over the door rang cheerfully. The interior smelled like heaven, all sugar and yeast and hot oil. Behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with flour on her apron looked up, saw their uniforms, and froze. Her hand moved toward something beneath the counter, maybe a weapon, maybe just instinct. Then she saw Jimmy standing in the doorway behind them and relaxed slightly. "Morning," she said carefully. "What can I get you boys?" Franz, whose English was best, stepped forward. "We would like donuts, please." "What kind?" The question paralyzed them. In camp, you took what was served. On the ranch, you ate what Mrs. Fletcher provided. But here, in this temple of American abundance, they were being asked to choose. The display case contained at least 15 varieties: glazed, powdered, chocolate-covered, jelly-filled, cream-filled, twisted, rounded, frosted in colors that seemed to have no connection to any natural food source. Franz struggled to find words. "We would like to try all of them." The woman's expression shifted. She studied them more carefully now, seeing past the uniforms to the young men wearing them. Klaus was 23 but looked older, weathered by years at war. Werner had a scar across his forehead from shrapnel. Otto's hands shook slightly, tremors from malnutrition that would take months to fully heal. "All of them," she repeated slowly. Then something in her face softened. "All right, give me a minute." She began filling a large white box, placing each variety carefully, making sure they got one of everything. When she finished, she set the box on the counter and said, $2. Jimmy stepped forward with Fletcher's money, but the woman waved him away. No charge today. You boys just enjoy them. They carried the box back to the truck like it contained gold. For the next hour, as Fletcher conducted business around town, 8 German prisoners sat in the truck bed and systematically tasted every donut variety that small Texas shop produced. They ate slowly, methodically, discussing each type with the seriousness of scholars analyzing ancient texts. The consensus emerged that glazed was the purest expression of the form, but chocolate-covered had its adherents, and the jelly-filled created passionate debate about proper filling-to-donut ratios. Klaus saved the last bite of a cream-filled donut, holding it carefully while the truck drove back toward the ranch. He thought about the woman in the shop, the way she'd looked at them, the decision she'd made to give food to enemy soldiers. He thought about his mother, who would have done the same because kindness was older than war, deeper than propaganda, more fundamental than the lies that made killing seem necessary. That night, he wrote his first letter home since capture. "Dear Mother," he began, then paused, uncertain how to explain what he needed to say. The censors would read this. They would cross out anything that seemed too critical of Germany or too praiseworthy of America. But he had to try. "I am well," he wrote. "We are treated fairly here, better than fairly. The food is good, more than enough. I have gained weight. There is something I've discovered here that I want to tell you about, though I'm not sure how to explain it properly. The Americans have a pastry called a donut. It is fried dough, sweet, simple. They eat it for breakfast without thinking, the way we might eat bread. But Mother, they give it to everyone, to soldiers and prisoners alike, to children and old men. There is no rationing, no careful division of limited resources. There is simply enough. I tell you this not to make you feel bad about our situation, but because I think it explains something about why we lost. Not because they were stronger or braver or more determined, but because they had enough, because their children were never hungry, because they could wage war without requiring their entire population to sacrifice everything just to survive. I don't know what comes after this war. I don't know what Germany will become or how we will rebuild. But I know that a country where everyone has enough to eat, where even prisoners receive donuts for breakfast, that country has understood something fundamental that we missed. Strength doesn't come from suffering. It comes from having enough to share. I think about you every day. I pray for you and the girls. And I promise you, when I come home, I will bring recipes. There will be enough again. Not just bread and potatoes, but sweetness too. Sweetness without earning it through pain. Your son, Klaus." He sealed the letter knowing it would likely never arrive, or would arrive so censored it made no sense. But writing it had clarified something inside him, had given shape to the transformation he'd felt happening since that first bite of donut in the camp mess hall. The war ended in May. News arrived through official channels first, then through camp newspapers, finally through letters from home that described surrender and occupation in tones of exhaustion and relief. The prisoners at Camp Bowie reacted with complicated emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped, grief for what had been lost, uncertainty about what came next. Some wept, others were silent. A few still clung to the belief that Germany would somehow rise again, though their voices grew quieter each day as reality settled over everyone like dust. Klaus received a letter from his mother in June. His hands shook as he opened it, terrified of what it might contain. The envelope was thin, just 2 sheets of paper, and the handwriting looked shakier than he remembered. "My dearest Klaus," she wrote, "we are alive. The house still stands. Your sisters are well, though Hannah lost her husband at Berlin. We have very little, but we have enough to survive. The Americans came through our town last month. They brought food, chocolate for the children, bread that wasn't made from sawdust. An officer asked if I had sons serving. I told him about you, about your capture in Texas. He seemed surprised. He said Texas was a good place, that you were probably being treated well. I didn't know if I should believe him, but I wanted to. Are you coming home? They say prisoners will be released slowly, that it could take months or years. I will wait however long it takes. We all will. But Klaus, when you come home, I need you to know that Germany is broken. Not just buildings and roads, but something deeper. We were wrong. About so many things. I don't know how to rebuild from that kind of wrongness, but we must try. Stay safe. Come home when you can. We will manage until then. Your mother. Klaus read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in his footlocker next to a small collection of items he'd accumulated. A rock from the Fletcher Ranch, a pressed flower from Texas grass, and, wrapped carefully in wax paper, a single donut that Mrs. Fletcher had given him on his last day of work, when she'd finally spoken to him directly to say, "You're a good worker. Don't forget that when you go home." The repatriation process began in August. Prisoners were processed in waves, screened for war crimes, evaluated for political reliability, sorted by hometown and region. Klaus learned he would be in the 3rd wave, departing in October for a long voyage back to Bremen, then overland to Bavaria to find whatever remained of his old life. The camp held a final meal for the departing prisoners. It wasn't required. It wasn't even particularly official. Colonel Davies simply decided that men who had worked hard and caused no trouble deserved a proper goodbye. The mess hall was decorated with American flags and German flags, a combination that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The meal was extensive: roast beef, mashed potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread, and of course, donuts. Hundreds of them, arranged on platters that covered an entire table. Every variety the camp kitchen could produce. Klaus stood before that table for a long moment, studying the donuts with something approaching reverence. A year ago, these simple pastries had represented everything he didn't understand about America, everything that contradicted the propaganda he'd absorbed. Now they represented something else, a kind of hope, evidence that abundance was possible, that sweetness didn't require suffering, that maybe, possibly, Germany could rebuild into something different from what it had been. What? He took a glazed donut and bit into it slowly, savoring the taste, memorizing it, storing it away for the dark times he knew were coming. The journey home, the ruins, the guilt of survival, the complicated work of rebuilding a country from its own ashes. Franz approached, carrying his own plate loaded with donuts. Strange to think we'll probably never taste these again. Someone will make them in Germany, Klaus said. After we rebuild, after things normalize. Will things ever normalize? Klaus didn't answer immediately. He finished his donut, licked sugar from his fingers, and watched American soldiers mixing with German prisoners in casual conversation, barriers dissolved by shared meals and shared humanity. I don't know, he finally admitted, but I know what I'm taking home with me. What? The memory of this, of being treated like a human being by our enemies, of eating breakfast pastries in a country that had every reason to hate us but chose kindness instead. That's worth remembering. That's worth building toward. The transport ship departed on a cool October morning. Klaus stood at the rail watching Texas recede into the distance, the flat horizon and endless sky becoming memory, becoming story, becoming the foundation of whatever came next. In his footlocker, carefully wrapped, he carried recipes for glazed donuts, chocolate donuts, cream-filled donuts. Mrs. Fletcher had written them out in careful handwriting, translating measurements from American to metric, adding notes about oil temperature and rising time. "You make these for your family," she'd said when presenting the papers. "You teach your children that good things are possible. That's how you rebuild." The voyage took 3 weeks. Klaus spent most of it below decks, talking with other prisoners about what awaited them. Some had no homes to return to. Others had received letters saying their families had been displaced, scattered across occupied Germany. A few had lost everyone. The conversations were quiet, matter-of-fact, grief processed through the practical details of survival: where to find housing, how to get ration cards, Whether the occupying forces were treating Germans fairly or with the vengeance many felt was deserved, Klaus contributed little to these discussions. His thoughts were elsewhere, focused on a single goal that had crystallized during his year in Texas. He was going to open a bakery, not immediately, not while everything was rubble and rationing, but eventually, someday. He was going to make donuts in Bavaria, and he was going to sell them to everyone regardless of their past, and he was going to prove that sweetness could exist without requiring suffering to earn it. The ship docked in Bremen on a gray November morning. Klaus stepped onto German soil for the first time in 2 years and felt nothing. No surge of patriotism, no relief, just exhaustion and a grim determination to survive whatever came next. The processing center was efficient, but cold, sorting returning prisoners by region, issuing temporary papers, providing minimal rations for the journey home. The train to Munich took 18 hours through landscape that looked like the surface of another planet. Cities reduced to rubble, bridges destroyed, countryside scarred by tank tracks and artillery craters. Klaus watched it all through dirty windows, feeling something inside him grow harder with each mile. This was what ideology had purchased. This was the cost of believing propaganda over evidence, hatred over humanity, revenge over redemption. His mother's house was still standing, not undamaged. The roof had been partially destroyed by bombing, then covered with tarps and scrap wood. The windows were boarded up. The garden was overgrown. But the walls stood, and when he knocked on the door at sunset on a cold November evening, his mother opened it and saw her son and collapsed into his arms weeping. That first night, they ate potato soup. Not because they wanted to, but because potatoes were what they had. The ration system was improving but still severe, and luxuries like sugar or butter were rare enough to feel fictional. Klaus said nothing about the abundance he'd experienced in Texas, didn't mention the donut shop or the Fletcher Ranch or the camp meals that had included dessert as routine rather than exception. What purpose would it serve except to make his mother's suffering feel more acute? But the next morning, he unpacked his footlocker. His mother watched as he pulled out Mrs. Fletcher's recipes, the papers worn from handling but still readable. She studied them carefully, her expression unreadable, then looked at her son with something like wonder. "Where did you get these?" "From a woman in Texas, a rancher's wife. She taught me to make them while I worked on her land." "They gave you sugar to practice with?" "They had sugar to spare. Mother, they had everything to spare." She was quiet for a long moment, running her fingers over the recipe paper as if it were precious metal. Then, "We can't make these now. We don't have the ingredients." "I know. But someday?" "Someday," Klaus promised. "When things are better, when we've rebuilt, I'm going to open a bakery and I'm going to make these for everyone. And I'm going to charge so little that even the poorest families can afford them. Because that's what I learned in America. Sweetness shouldn't be earned through suffering. It should just be available." His mother started crying again, but this time the tears felt different. Not grief, but something closer to hope, fragile as new ice on winter puddles, but present nonetheless. It took 4 years. 4 years of rubble clearing and currency reform and occupation authority and Marshall Plan economics. 4 years of working construction jobs during the day and studying at night, learning business principles from books translated from English. 4 years of saving every spare Deutsche Mark, collecting favors, networking with other survivors who were also trying to rebuild something new from the ruins of something terrible. In 1949, Klaus opened his bakery in Munich. It was small, just a storefront with one oven and a display case that held maybe 20 donuts at a time. He'd had to improvise the recipes slightly, adapting to German ingredients and German tastes. The first batch came out too dense, the second burned, the third were acceptable, the fourth were good. By the 6th batch, he'd found the sweet spot, creating donuts that captured the essence of what he'd tasted in Texas while accommodating the reality of what German supply chains could provide. He named the shop Amerikaner, which was both the German word for a type of cookie and a clear reference to where the idea had originated. The first customers were curious neighbors who came because novelty was still rare enough to feel precious. They tried the donuts skeptically, uncertain about this American food being made by a former prisoner of war. But the taste spoke for itself. The word spread. Within a month, Klaus had lines out the door every morning. He kept his promise about pricing. The donuts cost less than they should have, less than pure business logic would recommend. He made up the difference through volume, through efficiency, through a willingness to work 18-hour days to ensure everyone who wanted a donut could afford one. Franz found him in the spring of 1950. Klaus was behind the counter, filling a display case with fresh glazed donuts, when he looked up and saw his old friend standing in the doorway. They hadn't seen each other since Bremen, since that first processing center where returning prisoners had been sorted and dispersed. Franz looked older, thinner, wearing a cheap suit that didn't quite fit, but he was smiling. "So you actually did it," Franz said in German. "I did," Klaus confirmed. "Are you going to buy a donut or just stand there?" "Both." They sat at a small table near the window and ate donuts and talked about everything that had happened since the war ended. Franz had gone back to teaching, though the curriculum was completely different now, focused on democracy instead of destiny, on cooperation instead of conquest. He'd married a woman from his hometown who had also survived. They were trying to have children, trying to build something normal out of the abnormality they'd endured. "Do you ever think about Texas?" Franz asked eventually. "Every day," Klaus admitted. "Every single day." "Do you think they know, the Americans, what those donuts meant to us?" Klaus considered this while watching morning light fall across his small bakery, illuminating sugar crystals like tiny stars. "I don't think they could know, not really. To them it was just breakfast, just surplus shared with prisoners because they had enough to share. But that's the point, isn't it? They had enough. That's what we're rebuilding toward. Not supremacy or dominance or any of that madness. Just enough food, enough shelter, enough safety that we can waste sugar on frivolous pastries without guilt." Franz nodded slowly. "Think we'll get there?" "We're here, aren't we? Eating donuts in Munich, that's a start." The bakery thrived. By 1955, Klaus had expanded twice, hired 6 employees, opened a second location. His donuts became famous throughout Munich, then Bavaria, then gradually across West Germany, as returning POWs spread the word about the former prisoner who had brought American sweetness home. He never advertised using his war experience directly, but it was known, whispered about, part of the story that made his bakery feel like more than just a business. In 1960, an American journalist came to interview him. The article was for a magazine back in Texas, part of a series on what had happened to German POWs after the war. The journalist was young, probably too young to have fought, and he asked questions with the earnest curiosity of someone trying to understand history that had happened just before his time. "Why donuts?" he asked. "Of all the American things you could have brought back, why this?" Klaus thought about how to answer. He could talk about the taste, the simplicity, the business opportunity, but none of that was really true. The truth was deeper, stranger, harder to articulate to someone who hadn't experienced what he'd experienced. "Because they represented everything the propaganda told us was impossible," he finally said. "We were taught that America was weak because it was abundant, that suffering built character and comfort bred decadence. And then I was captured, taken to Texas and fed donuts for breakfast by the same men we'd been trying to kill. It destroyed my ideology faster than any political lecture could have. Because you can't hate people who feed you for no reason, except that they have enough to share. The donuts weren't just food. They were proof that another way was possible, that a country could be strong and kind simultaneously, that abundance didn't automatically breed weakness, that maybe, possibly, we had been lied to about everything that mattered." The journalist scribbled notes furiously. "And now you're teaching that lesson to Germans?" "I'm not teaching anything. I'm just making donuts. People can take from that what they want." But he knew it was more than that. Every customer who came through his door, every family that bought donuts for Sunday breakfast, every child who bit into sugared dough and smiled, they were all participating in a quiet revolution. A revolution that said prosperity was possible, that sweetness didn't require suffering to justify it, that the future could taste different from the past if you were willing to learn from former enemies. Klaus never returned to America. He thought about it sometimes, wondered what had happened to the Fletcher ranch, whether Mrs. Fletcher was still alive, whether Camp Bowie still stood or had been converted to something else once the war's urgencies faded. But going back felt unnecessary. He'd brought what mattered home with him, not just recipes but understanding, not just technique, but philosophy. He died in 1987, having lived long enough to see Germany reunified, to watch his country transform from ruins into prosperity, to witness his small bakery become a Munich institution. The shop still operates today. His children run it now, then his grandchildren, maintaining the original recipes with only minor modifications for modern health standards and ingredient availability. They've added new varieties, adapted to changing tastes, installed modern equipment, but the core product remains the same. Simple fried dough, sweetened with sugar, served to everyone who wants one at prices designed to be accessible rather than maximally profitable. Above the counter hangs a framed photograph from 1945. It shows 8 young men in prisoner uniforms standing in front of a donut shop somewhere in Texas, holding a white box, and smiling with an innocence that seems impossible given what they'd experienced. Someone found the photo decades later in an American archive and sent it to the bakery, and the family had it enlarged and framed as a reminder of where their success originated. Not in business acumen or culinary innovation, but in a moment of bewildering kindness during history's cruelest century, in the simple act of feeding enemies because there was enough to share. In donuts that tasted like a different future was possible. And maybe that's the real lesson, the one Klaus understood that day in Camp Bowie's mess hall when he took his first bite and felt his entire worldview crack open like sugar dissolving in coffee. War ends. Ideology fails. Propaganda crumbles. But the memory of unexpected kindness, of sweetness offered without condition, that memory rebuilds worlds, one donut at a time.